Yes,
Thank you.
of course.
All right, we'll go ahead and get going. By my count, it's noon. And so we've got James Liu and Bethany Day presenting today.
Awesome. I don't know if people normally introduce themselves, but if you don't know me, I'm James. I'm an IH student. So I'm with all those guys that run around with the air pumps and the fun toys. And um, usually people are kind of annoyed when they see us at work because it means they're about to get hassled their whole shift. But yeah, glad to be here. So the article that I picked is Workplace Violence in the Emergency Department. And this study specifically is a systematic review and meta-analysis. The reason I picked this is I'm sure you can tell it's not really IH related too much, but I picked it because I think it's just an interesting topic, and I think it's germane for any professional who works in occupational health because I think workplace violence can kind of happen anywhere, and when it does, it has a pretty, I think, negative and deep impact on the workplace and people who are involved with it. So, I should probably mention this photo here. It's not from the actual study. I generated that on AI. I'm sure you can tell by their hands merging together. But that's what came up when I put in workplace violence. Well, actually, it didn't let me use the word violence because it was a like restricted, inappropriate term. So I did workplace aggression. And as you can see, this topic of this study is actually workplace violence in the emergency department for like physicians and nurses. And so I did another prompt. I think for this one, I put in patient yells at doctor. And so I don't know what this patient's in for. I'm assuming something for her face because it's a little bit warped. But that's my use of AI and integration of it, some interesting visuals to hopefully boost engagement. So just kind of some introductory terms we need to know. In this study, obviously the primary population I'm looking at are healthcare workers in the emergency department. And so you're going to see these acronyms everywhere. HCW for healthcare workers and ED for emergency departments. And of course, the thing that we're trying to measure and understand is workplace violence, which will be abbreviated as WPV. So you're going to see these a lot. So just kind of keep these on the back of your mind for what they mean. So just some introductory stuff that the journal talks about. Uh, in the United States, the rate of non-fatal workplace injuries due to workplace violence against healthcare workers is 5 to 12 times higher than the rates for US workers overall. I think we all probably know nurses or doctors, especially those who work in emergency departments, and have heard their horror stories of, people coming in and they're acting crazy or they have to be restrained. Patients need to be strapped down to the bed or whatever. And I think it's a really unfortunate truth. And that's why I think this meta-analysis was done because it's an important and ongoing issue. So here's a graph that I made. It's hopefully that made the title text a little small, but it says days away from work per 10,000 workers. And this data is from 2013. And so you can see that basically, if you take what you consider as your normal US worker, a non-governmental, non-healthcare worker, this rate sits just at like 2.4, around there. And hospital employees, it goes up significantly, and nursing and residential care, much, much higher, presumably because those kind of people are in less well of a mental state. So it's obviously a big issue. And the journal talks about how healthcare workers in the emergency department specifically are at an even increased risk for violence because of their unique work environment. And they cited several studies talking about what makes this work environment unique to this problem. And some of the things they identified were like intoxication is common amongst patients, hopefully not the doctors and nurses, but the people that they will work with often are intoxicated, right? Car crashes, whatever. These people are more prone to be violent. These people that ED workers work with are more prone to have mental health issues. There's also environmental, socio-environmental factors that might make people a little bit more aggressive or more agitated, such as long wait times, often caused and compounded by understaffed emergency departments. And this is also a pretty important aspect that isn't found in most places, but emergency departments are generally open to the public, right? You break your arm and your bone's sticking out, so you're going to walk in straight to the emergency department, they'll let you walk in. And so uh, anyone can go in. And I think it goes without saying that workplace violence is bad, but they still wanted to talk about it in the journal. They cited several reasons through other articles of what makes workplace violence so detrimental and such a pressing issue. And that's because workplace violence is just harmful to the mission of healthcare overall. Uh, I think it's not only just principally against the mission of making people well, but it also has a significant, I think, emotional and psychological impact on those who witness it and experience it and are victims of it. And obviously, it's very destructive to the health of emergency department personnel. It Studies have shown that workplace violence in the ED has caused increased days away from work, decreased productivity, and all of these things ultimately lead to a decrease in quality of patient care. So, goes without saying that workplace violence is bad, but it really is an issue in this system. So, for this study, I know that there's a lot of ideas of what violence can be, but it's defined pretty simply. And in this study, they defined it as either physical violence perpetrated against a healthcare worker or verbal abuse, which is significantly more common. In fact, just to give you an idea of sort of some of the existing literature that they were looking at before they did their analysis, they kind of got an estimate that verbal violence is a lot more common than physical violence. They said that a recent meta-analysis of workplace violence for all healthcare workers in China identified that verbal abuse was most prevalent at 61%, while physical violence was reported to be 13.7. So the purpose of this study is they wanted to do not only systematic review, but also a meta-analysis uh, to evaluate all the available data out there on the prevalence of workplace violence amongst ED staff and who the main instigators of workplace violence were in emergency departments. And what I think is cool about this study is it wasn't like a national study like the one they cited, just looking at Chinese healthcare workers, but it's a global one. They tried to look at every body of data available. So to do this, kind of started how you would always start any kind of meta-analysis or systematic review. They picked a method for filtering out and looking through articles. And this was called the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis Protocols Reporting Guideline. It's also known as PRISMA, if you don't want to say all that. Is anyone here familiar with PRISMA? Any of you used it in any of your research? Okay. See a nod. It has a cool name, so maybe I'll use it someday. But basically, they started their study by doing a lit search in 2019, late 2019. They searched two databases, PubMed and Scopus. And these actually, they listed their actual search terms. So in PubMed and Scopus, they're pretty similar. Inclusion criteria was pretty simple. They just wanted studies of adult patients, which specifically instigated violence against ED staff, and studies which it reported the instigators of violent incidents. In other words, just like any study that kind of talked about who was instigating violence. They had a lot of exclusion criteria. Uh, they def they definitely did their due diligence here. They excluded everything that was not they excluded anything that was violence against people that weren't physicians or nurses, actual ED staff. They excluded studies aimed at measuring the violence between healthcare workers or pre-hospital personnel, so inner fighting. They also excluded studies that did not measure workplace violence in the ED, such as issues of domestic violence or things not occurring at the workplace that they were interested in. They also excluded any individual case reports detailing instances of workplace violence, things maybe like a root cause incident report for one incident. And they also excluded editorials and opinion pieces. So they included this graphic, this their figure one, and this shows kind of their flow and their use of Prisma on how they picked what they wanted. And so I think initially they found 301 articles to sift through from the two databases. And as you can see, all their exclusion criteria whittled it down, and they eventually had 26 studies which were analyzed by hand, and 22 of them had the quantitative data needed to be part of a meta-analysis. So, um, quite a few studies out there, but they narrowed it down a lot more than I thought they would. So, in to actually get the data out of these studies, um, data for each outcome was directly extracted according to the outcome definitions of the study they were looking at. And these definitions were not modified by them to kind of fit any specific model or categorization. And so these metrics and outcomes that they measured and took out of the studies included prevalence of workplace violence, the countries of origin according to WHO regions. So I guess not really so much countries, but more like WHO regions, which is a big, broad geographical area. They also measured types of violence. They measured instigators, who they were. And lastly, they also took out professional position of the victim, whether it's the study was looking at physicians or nurses or both. So their statistical methods were, I didn't understand some of it, but this is kind of what I got out of it was that the measured overall prevalence and just prevalence of any of these incidents through their Simeon layered random effects model. And it looks like they also transformed the data a couple times using a logit transformation and then a back transformation. So I'm sure that was really good. And something they were also concerned about. Go ahead.
A comment from someone online or a question from Micah. He's asking, was there an explanation on why they excluded studies concerning violence against ED staff?
Is he referring to? So I think that is specifically when they excluded that, they were trying to like get rid of ones that were against perhaps janitors or non like medical personnel is kind of what I understood. But yeah, they tried to include mainly like physicians and nurses. Let's see. So that's kind of how they determined prevalence from all these different studies. I think they mentioned several times that they're concerned with the heterogeneity of the data, seeing as they're pulling from all kinds of different studies. And so they actually statistically checked for heterogeneity using the I squared and Cochrane's chi-squared test. I almost said chi-squared test because I used to say that to annoy my statistics professor on purpose. But anyways, that was not relevant. They also did subgroup analysis and meta-aggression for the following groups to check for the source of heterogeneity. And the ones that they specifically categorized and looked at it by was publication year of the study, the sample size within the study, the region of the world it came from, and the professional position, like which medical staff were the ones that the subjects of that study. Um, Kind of like many other studies, they just used a p-value of 0.05. Less than that was considered to be statistically significant. And statistical analyses were performed using a meta package of R version 3.6.1. I'm not very familiar with that, but uh, so they're also worried about some sources of potential bias. One of the things that they immediately noted is that every single study that they pulled from was a retroactive study. And so there's a high chance of recall bias potentially. Additionally, another thing that these researchers were actually put a lot of emphasis on is the fact that when it comes to workplace violence, there is no standardized universal way to categorize and report what violence would be, such as if a researcher were to ask a workplace saying, were you verbally abused or verbally bullied? There's no like standardized survey, standardized question, standardized way to measure that and to pose that question and to receive an answer in that. So they were concerned that there are potentially some differences in reporting or in the actual accuracy of the measurements between the studies. They also were worried, they mentioned individual bias on what is perceived as violence could have also played an impact. For example, they speculated that many who may have reported violence could have been affected by whether or not the instigator of that violence was male or female, was of a certain race, age, or other physical characteristics. You know, if they're very intimidating and aggressive, I'm sure that would increase the rates of reporting for that. So these are some of the biases that they were worried about. So the results, to start off, of all the studies they did in the meta-analyses, it was 22 studies, I believe. They had majority nurses and rest physicians, and then a few other ED workers, medical staff. And of the over 9,000 total cases of workplace violence that was analyzed from the 21 studies that reported verbal violence, 72% of all the workplace violence incidents were verbal violence, 18% physical abuse, and 9.5 some other type, such as stalking or sexual harassment. Of the 13 studies that reported on the type of instigator that was causing the violence, which was a total of 2,578 individuals, it was found that those instigating were actually 52% family members. So if your mom comes and sees you in the emergency room, maybe don't make her angry. And 27.2% were patients, which surprised me. I thought it would be a lot more instigators caused by just random people. And the other 20.8% was just a different relation, such as a friend or other relative. So these results actually surprised me quite a bit. When you think of workplace violence, you just think of random acts of violence, random breakouts of violence, but it's probably still pretty random, but it's caused a lot by people who they know, which surprised me. So they included a table of the descriptive data on all the studies they analyzed in their meta-analysis. So here we can see that almost all the regions of the world were included in this analysis. Notably, the only one that was not included was the African region. None of the studies came from there, and only one of the studies came from the Americas, which includes North and South America, and only two from the Western Pacific region, which is like China, East Asia. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Here's just kind of a chart of the WHO regions if you wanted to kind of compare. So like most of the studies came from blue Europe and India and green Middle Eastern area, none from Africa, very little from red or orange. So kind of interesting. When it comes to staff position, which was one of the descriptive statistics that they looked at, there was not really any conclusive findings on the difference of prevalence by staff position. And this is kind of supported by the existing literature, is what they're talking about. They kind of mentioned how research on whether or not staff position affects whether or not you'll be a victim of workplace violence, it's pretty ambivalent. There's some saying yes, some saying no. So some of the current and future actions that they've talked about, because this is a very pressing issue, is they talked about how the ACEP, American College of Emergency Physicians, they've been pretty involved with this issue. They've made several statements, including putting out a policy letter to help guide hospital administration in implementing proper controls and proper protections for their staff. There's also been pretty recent interest There's been studies that have been conducted to try to help predict when what causes incidents of violence in the emergency departments. And also there's been studies to see what the most effective ways to address agitation and address potential violence is. So I think that's pretty cool. Another really interesting thing is that ASAP also recently endorsed the passing of this House resolution in Congress called the Workplace Violence Prevention for Healthcare and Social Service Workers Act. And what's cool is I actually went to the congress.gov website to see like what the state of this bill was, because this study came out in 2019. It was published in 2000. Uh, it's not like, yeah. Anyways, I just wanted to see where I was at. So it's cool. It passed in the House, pretty large, pretty large majority. And I guess it's in the Senate now. So who knows how long that'll take. But it looks like it has a lot of support. And I thought that's a cool update. It's been endorsed and it's been passed in the House. So hopefully it'll go into law. And this law basically requires, like legally, for hospitals and medical organizations to like create reasonable protections for their staff and doctors and nurses against workplace violence. Some limitations of this study that they talked about is that, like I mentioned, they did not like the limited uniformity in the definitions when it comes to something like, were you verbally abused? That there's no universal way to define that or to answer that. They also were a little concerned with their reporting, saying to use caution when interpreting the data because there was a high heterogeneity among the studies they used for their meta-analysis. But the conclusion was actually very short. They said that this is a very pressing issue. Workplace violence in the emergency department is extremely high and needs to be addressed. And it's concerning because there is no universal approach to measuring workplace violence because there are varying definitions. This can lead to differences in reporting amongst workplace violence studies. And their like final conclusion and recommendation was they said further development of clear definitions of violence is necessary to gain a greater understanding of the source and solution to workplace violence. So that's everything. I hope it was interesting to you guys. Do you guys have any questions?
Are you sure that the family members were family members of the healthcare workers and not family members of the patients? I find it hard to believe that there would be that many like family members of the healthcare workers in contact with
That's a good question. As far as I,
patients. Family members, patients generally angry.
yeah, yeah, I'm not sure. I'll have to go back and review and make sure I interpreted that correctly, because I was pretty surprised by that finding. And one thing that I did think is it is possible that workplace violence against hostile staff is generally not it's rare enough that if it were to occur, maybe there would be a reason to trigger it, and that reason would be the provider. Uh, but you could totally be right, and my intuition could be off. I'll have to review that.
It didn't specify. The article did not specify that if the family member was the patient or the.
So the answer.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
What the pros and cons are
Yeah, that's true.
for excluding alcohol and drug related violence.
I think that's difficult because in this sense, they probably considered it as a confounder, where alcohol related violence might be its own issue that maybe would have different types of interventions and different considerations for how to prevent it than just sober violence. So I imagine that might be why they separated that.
My comment is if it's really about prevalence, they're probably severely underestimating the prevalence of violence as a safety and health concern for healthcare workers, because if alcohol and drug abuse or intoxicated patients are common and that's a common source of violence, they're excluding probably more than enough cases. And then another comment was I don't know. I didn't find it, but I don't know if the authors made an attempt to turn the prevalence rate prevalent into a rate, like this many violence occurrences per this many hours work. So that would help out a lot with how often is this happening, like injury
Right.
rates. Yeah.
Right.
So your
Yeah,
thoughts?
well, to answer that, I do recall they said based off their meta-analysis, about 77% of all healthcare workers they estimate from this data have experienced verbal violence. So that is like a rate, but they didn't provide a lot of them.
Prevalence in the past X period of time, but a person may report experiencing it, but they might have had it 10 times in the past.
That's true.
Or 1 time in the past year.
Yeah, so it's not really a real incidence. Yeah.
How frequently is this happening per unit time or per full time?
I agree. I think that would be good.
So this study came out a year after another study that came out on emergency medical responders and violence in their occupation. And the estimates there were like 90% or more of medical responders have experienced verbal or physical violence in the line of duty. And so and this is not something that this paper answers that, or that I'm expecting you to answer, but one question that came to mind to me as I was thinking about that paper and this paper, I was thinking about, okay, if the emergency medical responders are dealing with either an upset patient or upset bystander, that sort of thing, and then they bring some of that with them, how much of this is part of that handoff from emergency medical responders to emergency department, and so forth? How many of these are that versus originating in the ED and that sort of thing? So it's just kind of a curiosity there because it is so prevalent among those folks as well.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and if what you're saying about the last study, is right, it seems like the rate is significantly higher for the first responders than those actually at the hospital, which so maybe it means the first responders managed to strap them down or something. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, by the time they get, if it's a patient, by the time they get there, if they are allowed to restrain, then a lot of that is taken care of. But in a lot of places, there have been cases where emergency medical responders have been sued by patients for having restrained them.
Huh.
And so forth, right?
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
there's some laws and things that are starting to be enacted and so forth. We had a guest here, Dr. Taylor, Jen Taylor came and spoke about some of this a year or so ago. I almost wish she could come back every year and talk about it, but yeah, it's one of those things where they may mitigate the effect on the ED, and yet even in the ED, they're still experiencing it at a really high rate.
Yeah.
So
Is it related to ER wait times?
The they actually did speculate that that's probably a reason workplace violence is so high in EDs is because of long wait times in understaffed areas.
I just kind of have a question to build off what Dr. Olson was talking about in terms of the rate. When you first mentioned that there was a 67, I think, percent verbal reporting, it made me wonder, are they talking about in the last year or in their entire time? And if as nurses or doctors or whatever, and if that's the case, if they're talking specifically about that their entire time, then wouldn't age or tenure, specifically tenure in the organization, be a confounder that they might want to look at? That's just what I was thinking.
That's true. Yeah. And I think they might have thought of that, or if they didn't, they accidentally might have implied it when they said, yeah, there's some issues with heterogeneity of our population and of all our data. So that could definitely play an influence, especially since it looks like the way they're reporting their outcomes is, has it ever happened to a healthcare worker? And that's how they report like the prevalence of it. So I think that's a really good point.
Got a comment from Mallory, and this might be a good one to end on. Did the study mention any future intent to research further based on like occupation, gender, other specifics? And I'd also be curious about your thoughts about what could be an interesting direction in that way to study for them.
Yeah, the study seemed mostly focused on they wanting to harmonize a universal way of defining and reporting workplace violence. So that kind of was like their main suggestions going forward. I personally thought kind of along the same lines of just like how with OSHA, there's really a universal way in the United States to report reportable incidents and injuries and deaths. I think a way for something for workplace violence that was across the whole nation and through one organization, I think that would be a really great way to aggregate data in a more universal way. So that's what I think would be a good direction to take that.
Just one last, I just wanted to comment about the methodology. I really wish that they included more databases. They only did the search on PubMed and Scopus. We have Google Scholar where you can pull so many articles from there that most of the time we can't find on PubMed or other databases. And also, I think it's Web of Science. I'm not sure, but it's a big database that usually we can find articles from other countries that also cannot be found in, like searching both PubMed or Scopus. And especially when we're trying to do systematic review on a global level, we should be using other sources that is not just PubMed or Scopus. So that is just like my observation for this particular study.
Yeah, I can agree with that. When I found the study, I looked at that title and was like, oh, they're doing a big systematic review and meta-analysis. And then I was reading the message like, oh, they only looked at 2 different databases. I was a little bit surprised by that. And so that's a great point.
They are fairly good and rigorous databases. So I'll encourage my students to use existing indexed scientific databases because that's where you will find peer-reviewed literature, but supplement it with things like Google Scholar. Now I wonder also asking AI to help you find literature, who knows, but yeah, there's value in using the index databases, but then supplementing with Google Scholar.
I would use these 2 for sure, and then add the other ones just to make sure we are screening for as many articles as possible.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for asking lots of questions that weren't too hard. And I appreciate it.
James?
Oh yeah. Steal that.
Maybe put it in, and then when you go to the question. Yes, just whatever you sort of want to.
There, well, there's some negatives.
No? Maybe not. I know. I'm just supposed to switch that on, right?
It should be good.
Oh,
Yep.
it's just not close to my face. Okay, I just kind of want to start out with get a feel for what you guys know about mining in Utah. Anybody from Utah? Was there anything that you remember growing up about mining in Utah? So when I think of mining in Utah, I think of Kennecott. Like if anybody's heard of Kennecott. Yeah. Kennecott got bought out by Rio Tinto in 1998. It used to be an old mine that was kind of not in good shape. And they came in, and if you think about Rio Tinto, they are also the soccer stadium, the history museum, Daybreak, the city. They built that, they made it livable, and people were able to get water there. So they've done a lot of things in Utah. But have you ever heard that mining is bad?
Yes.
I think that's a pretty common mentality especially today. We're a lot more aware of things that happened, you know, back when coal mining began. And we do have a coal mine down in Price, Utah. Thousands of miners were dying here. So, and now we have it down in like in double digits and things. So there's been a lot of progress in mining. All right. All right. So mining kind of has an ethics issue with sustainability. We've been known, the industry is known to have a lot of deaths, a lot of disasters, but also exploiting workers. Slavery was a big part of mining historically. So that's kind of, I think, still kind of that thought that people have. But today there's been a big change, or the last couple decades, there's been a real shift in transformation of mining and sustainability. Part of that reason, so our stakeholders, so communities, investors, they're aware of the stigma with mining. And so they're requiring mining operations and companies to start doing things that are good sustainably. Again, that scrutiny in the mining world has really encouraged a lot of mining companies to create a better name for themselves. And Rio Tinto has done a really good job at that. And then additionally, mining is kind of a big starting point of a lot of our safety laws. And OSHA, MSHA, a lot of that spurred from mining. And so there are new rules. There's the EPA rules, there's MSHA, and so they're now required to be sustainable. It's not an option anymore. In order for them to get licenses, like be able to purchase land, anything, they have to be sustainable. So it is a necessary move in the industry to do that, or we won't survive. And more research around it about how they're affecting environments and people, and also how they're improving. So my paper is Pathway to Sustainability in the Mining Industry, looking at Alcoa and Rio Tinto. So one of the reasons these were selected, their control variables, was their size, their ownership, and their history. So as you can see, they're in multiple countries across the globe. They are Fortune 500 companies, and they're ranked pretty high in that. Both of them have been mining for over 100 years. So actually, Alcoa invented aluminum mining. That's where that came from. And at one point, they were some of the only ones that could actually mine aluminum. And Rio Tinto, they're really big in copper. They're one of the leaders in multiple resources like copper, diamonds, borat, so lots of different things. So they're very well known, they're big. Rio Tinto, I think, employs 46,000 people. So that's why they were selected. They've been around a long time. They've shown that they are profitable. And then in addition, they actually are integrating sustainability into the core of their business. So they're not just following regulations, but as a whole, this is something that they are requiring. So I'm not a big AI person or a technology person. You met me. I'm more of a live in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. So I've been real resistant, and someone suggested that I use ChatGPT, and that's been really interesting. Chatting with the computer. It is really nice. But I wanted to generate, I asked her, or him, her, I don't know, I asked what it wanted to be called. It said Chat GPT. But anyways, I asked for a couple definitions. She said, there you go. And I felt like they were pretty spot on for what's known. So we talk about sustainability, but I think there's a limit of what we know about it. So it's much more than just the environment. It's social responsibility and economic responsibility. So it's what we're known as the 3 pillars of sustainability. Anybody heard of that? So that's kind of a requirement. That's what a lot of those laws require. They look at economics, they look at the environment, and they look at people. And so you have to meet those standards and fulfill all 3 pillars in order to call yourself sustainable. So both of them have very similar goals as far as, so they both put out a sustainability report. That's where they analyze their own business, what they're doing, what they can improve on, and what they plan to do. So they create some sort of strategy and initiatives out of these sustainability reports. And so this is what they looked at in the paper, as they referred to. As when they gathered data, it was mostly looking at other research, but sustainability reports and the footprint analysis we'll talk about in a minute is the most data they offered, really. With so obviously kind of things we're used to, climate change, emissions. Rio Tinto is very big. I know a lot of mine say safety, but they actually are really big on safety. I had friends that work there, and when they brought in this idea, people were kind of resistant. And they go, oh, they don't mean it. And so they started testing them. They're like, I have a paper cut. And they'd say, okay. And they wouldn't mock, or they'd make a note and they'd put it in their reports. And then actually, one of the employees said, you actually started to see things get fixed once we started reporting things. But Rio Tinto has followed through with that promise. So the pillars, obviously, you know, they want to be profitable, they want to be responsible, innovations. The drivers of why they want to do these things, they actually have very good reason. And that's what kind of the authors point out, is that sustainability actually leads to success in mining. So Alcoa is the leader in aluminum mining, and you can actually, it's one of the few ores that can be recycled 100%. And they actually have found a lot of ways to use their waste, even like their aluminum dust. They will sell them to steel mills, and they are allowing their customers to bring back scrap metal, and so they're constantly recycling. And this actually reduces their need for electricity, like by 70%, I believe. And because they're not having to extract anymore. They're not having to go to all that effort to get out the ore out of the rock. And then Rio Tinto, they actually across the globe work in really high risk areas. So I think one place in the subarctic, they do mining there. So there's a lot of places like that, and climate change affects those areas. And so they need safe roads. They need the things that allow them to get to the mines, and that requires them to kind of think about the environment and encourage them to not destroy the things around them, because they can't function. They depend on these resources to function. So one of the big things that's going on is that transformation with the stakeholders, is they are interested, they want change. And the AI said was quite similar to the article, as far as it's someone who has an investment in mining, and their actions will affect them. So pretty much all of us are stakeholders. And all these pictures are actually of Rio Tinto that I have, that like being up the mine. They actually used to do tours that would that's why I asked if you grew up, you know, they would do tours and you go see the open pit mine. And then they had the collapse and they closed the visitor center down. So, but all these pictures are about like with the smelter and things. So, but one of the things the researchers looked at and determined whether these two businesses were not just sustainable, but had integrated it, was an environmental footprint analysis. And so the tool that is most commonly used is looking at a mine's life cycle. And so a mine life cycle has exploration. That's when you're going and checking to see you got boots on the ground, kind of like using GPS and things to see if you can find ore. And then this, I always forget. I should have this memorized. And then when they do find the ore, there's development. That's when they start drilling. That's when they start breaking in. And then you have extraction. And so that can be underground or above ground surface mining. And one of the new things that they do is closure. So mines didn't used to have to, like once they closed shop, they didn't have to do anything. They just left it. And now mine regulations require them to actually put that in their plan. They have to set money aside, funds aside, so that they don't leave the communities, like the good Boy Scout motto of leave it better than when you found it. And so actually, if you look at the Ochre Mountains, you can see Rio Tinto doing a lot of like reclamation and already putting their tailings, laying those down, and kind of doing it as they go. So with the 3 pillars, you have an environmental responsibility. So mining has that responsibility because it requires so much to make mining happen. A lot of oil, or coal, a lot of machinery, a lot of people. And so just in general, energy-wise, it just takes a lot to run a mine. And like I said, every one of those stages actually have some sort of pollution. They do some kind of disruption to the environment. Oh, I did that twice. So climate change, both are interested, actually. Rio wants to be net zero carbon by 2050. And Alcoa, I think I think it's 2025. So by next year, because this paper was in 2020, they want to be at 30%, and then in 2050, no, they want to be at 50%, and then by 2025, they want to be at 30%. Both of them are, let's see, water. Like they're doing things like water is getting scarce, and it's necessary for minings to function with water. And they're learning to do things like take polluted water, clean it, and re-inject it back into the ground. And a lot of them are below water tables, and so this is becoming kind of a necessary thing, and they're required to actually clean any water that they do pollute.
Sometimes it gets finicky. You might have to go hit on the keyboard.
Oh, there we go. So the social responsibility. If you don't know, a lot of mines are quite disruptive to their communities. And there's a lot of issues where they're going into poor communities, and there's that potential of them taking advantage. They're also industrial. We all know industrial puts out pollution. And so these people are having to deal with dust. They're having to deal with emissions. They're having to deal with traffic, increased traffic, more people coming in. And so it really affects what the community around us. One of the other things that there's still a lot of them are in foreign countries, and there's still modern day slavery and human trafficking. And so some of the things that they're doing, like with the human trafficking, they have to put it in their clause with a lot of companies. They're trying to encourage their stakeholders to get engaged and require that we don't do this anymore, because mining has been used to exploit poor people. And so these are some of the foundations that they've done to work with people, and a lot of it, they work heavily with Indigenous people. And so they've actually done a lot of good things where they start programs and they're trying to work with the community. And economically, they have to keep up with their stakeholders, and they have to help the community in some way economically. And I thought it was interesting, the authors just kind of wrote that the community gets benefits financially through taxes, loyalties, things like that, but it depends on how community uses it. So I wouldn't suggest that. I felt was not a great point of strength that they tried to do because it seemed like, well, it's a depend thing. So I don't know if I would call that an initiative, but they seem to feel like that was worthy of mentioning of something that they do. The closure of the Argyle Diamond Mine is in Australia, and that is closing after 3 decades. And so it's displacing a lot of people. That's a lot of jobs. And so actually Rio Tinto is trying to help those employees find either jobs within the company or they're giving them skills to go find jobs elsewhere. Alcoa, I didn't feel like there was a lot that they were doing other than just they mentioned that they that they are trying to be economically responsible. In 2015, there was because there was an oversupply from China and some other holdups in the process, they were very low in the stocks. And so the authors said that they had to come up with ways to lower their own costs, which led to sustainability. But they didn't necessarily say how they did that, just that they needed to do it or they did do it. The authors said their best practices that why they are sustainable, not just sustainable, but why they've integrated it into their core business is that they've defined sustainability. They've met these things like tracking and reporting, but they also gave suggestions for them to improve. And it was more focused on Alcoa because Alcoa is struggling. And it was just more like they come up with a strategy, but they don't like define their strategy. They don't define their initiatives and they don't meet their targets. And they pointed out that a lot of those targets they didn't meet were ones that where stakeholders weren't involved. So they needed a better relationship with that. I think that's the end of that. But I guess some of the points I felt like the authors obviously were already starting out with a little bit of bias, pointing out that these people are sustainable, and it seemed like they just kept reinforcing. And I felt like there were gaps in that, like not mentioning what exactly that they're doing, just that they're doing sustainable things. Yeah, does anybody else have questions?
I'm curious, just your thoughts on this type of article versus a study where the authors, you know, went into a few mines and took measurements and tried to really sort of evaluate sustainability from an objective scientific standpoint. What do you think the value of each is? What do you think the value of an article like this is versus the, research project where they're evaluating sustainability?
To me, this felt more like it was like them being persuasive of sustainability is good for mining, which they prove that it does help in safety situations and things like that. And these businesses did this right, and this is how they got there. But a lot of it came from other research. And I think being in a mine is much different than reading about a mine. And I think technically geologists, it would be interesting to hear the point of view of like geologists and people who actually work in the industry to feel, because it's one thing when a company is reporting on itself, and obviously any paper can be skewed one way or another. And so it'd be interesting to get a more objective point of view.
And this is an interesting article, but I would actually, so a case study is a methodology. I don't feel like they did a case study here. I feel like they looked at various attributes of sustainability and looked at what maybe it was publicly available or other articles or whatever, and said, okay, are these two particular companies engaging in sustainability type practices? That's a more of a commentary than it is a case study. Whereas a case study would actually be more like what you were saying, Bubba, maybe not taking measurements, but you'd actually go to the location or go to whether it be an individual or a company or whatever, you would go and you would interview and you would interact with the company. You would maybe potentially, dig through their archival materials. you'd learn a lot about that one case, and then you'd report out on that, right? And this just felt a little bit too superficial for to be labeled a true case study. At least that was from what you presented and just my quick look at it before. Would suggest it's not, they didn't follow the case study methodology very closely.
Yeah, because the case study is an in-depth just observation of a person or a thing,
Yeah,
right? My
yeah,
understanding.
And this didn't feel very deep.
Yeah, I just felt, like I said, it felt just like they were trying to tell you, oh, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is.
It is good, but this could easily have just been a commentary, and not really a case study, so.
Yeah, and I felt like they lacked a lot of direct, like associating the company to these are, a few initiatives and things, but I felt like there was a lot of lacking of like, this is why they are sustainable and this is how they're doing it. But I felt like it was just more like, oh, they're sustainable.
Couple of comments. So I did check for conflicts of interest or potential conflicts of interest, because I thought, why do these people want to dig into these mining companies? And they declared no conflicts of interest, so they must have just been curious. And I think used publicly identifiable information. But I do want to say, if anybody's curious, I do think Kennecott has reopened visiting new center, their website. So if you are curious, I grew up here and I didn't see it until fairly recently. It's pretty amazing to go see the operations there. It's eye-opening if you want to see what it might looks and feels like right now.
It was the open pit, it was one of the, or probably it still is, one of the 7 wonders. Like it's so big, it can be seen.
Yeah, the trucks look like ants.
Yeah, I mean, that's just like a back of a haul truck that I'm standing in. And I have a few where like the tires are like, yeah, they're just, everything's giant. You feel like a little mini toy, but they just started, they've been preparing for a long time, but they just started doing, they're doing construction and to do underground mining there now.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say one more thing. Wouldn't it be great if every company had energy use, water use, like sustainability key performance indicators in their annual report? So yes, we should be skeptical of mining, but also it's encouraging that they have some key performance indicators related to sustainability in their publicly available reports. It could be greenwashing, you never know, but seems like a good thing.
The desire is definitely there, which gives opportunity to implement things that really work, I think. But and I do like that, like socially, they've taken a lot more responsibility.
I actually did an internship with Kennecott this summer, and they harped on their sustainability quite a bit. They did mention that it was a little different because that mine is so close to a city. Most of the times they're in the middle of nowhere. They also mentioned that they had several sites across the world, South Africa, Madagascar, Mongolia, places like that. And I was wondering, do you think that sustainability is homogeneous amongst those different sites, or perhaps is it just kind of catered to Kennecott specifically because of the close proximity to the city?
I think the way I know, and this is where I'll point out my bias. I am a big fan of Kennecott, but I think they generally do try and hold their standards across the board, but I think they take different approaches based on that community and the culture and the needs. But I've been in other mines too, like some of the ones in Nevada where it does take like an hour or 2 to get there, and there's definitely sketchy things for you, and they do talk about safety all the time. Like I remember someone saying, "Oh, I'm just covering up some spills," and I'm like, "What are you doing?" So you're doing that. I'm learning about the environment and how to clean it. But there's definitely a variance just among businesses, like or different operations. And I think there are less that are making sustainability a priority, and that there's like way too little that are, it needs to grow for sure. But the ones that will survive and continue to grow will make sustainability, I think, part of it. And I think that was the point of the authors too, is like sustainability is necessary for progress. Yeah.
Anything else? Right. Same time, same place next week. We'll see you there.